My name is Tamara Lanier, and I want to thank you all for coming, and thank you, Stephanie, for the invitation, Waterford Rise. There is so much here that I could talk about. I have 15 minutes, and she is going to bring me back to talk about what I think is most important, is to talk about just the grace and the faith that has brought me from where I was in 2010 and starting to tell the story to where I stand today. And I'll talk a little more about this, but when I do show you, you will have to acknowledge God's hand in this, because there's no other way that I could have connected with all of these world-renowned people and had world-renowned people reaching out to me, attorneys, the most powerful attorneys in the world, the Koskoff firm who worked with the Sandy Hook family and has sued Alex Jones and has historically sued the Remy. They're working with me, and they've been working with me since 2017. Attorney Ben Crump, an amazing story on how we met and how I sold this story to him. But you see God's hands at work, and I will talk a little bit about that later. But when I think about just the totality of the story, there's so much. There's reparations, there's repatriation, there's cultural appropriation. There's the question as to who has the right to tell their stories. There's also the issue of not only to tell your story, but then again, be a part of the conversation. And what my battle with Harvard has always been is to correct the narrative. Now, you saw a little bit about Louis Agassiz and who he was. He was a world-renowned scientist that Harvard courted from Europe, brought him to America at a time, a pivotal time in the 1800s when this country was divided with the question of either emancipation or slavery. And what's so ironic to me is how things, the more they change, the more they stay the same. And then again, the saying, if you don't learn from your history, you're doomed to repeat it. This is what we're doing even today. And it talks about the dangers of propaganda and how they create propaganda and misinformation because they knew that this was not true. And I believe that Harvard knew that Renty was an educator. He was a man of faith. He taught from the Bible. He taught people to read at a time when it could imperil his own life. And they knew this because the slaveholders write about the fact that they knew their slaves could read and teach the Bible. Harvard knew when they chose Renty that he was an educator and an educated man, but they created this false narrative because it was necessary to promote slavery. And also what's related here is how the North was complicit in this as well. When I was growing up, I was always taught about slavery in the South, that it was this Southern thing and that we were abolitionists in the North and we opposed these kind of things. And I'm just really now learning my history, the true history of this country and the true history of slavery in this country. But what this case really stresses is how complicit the North, particularly Massachusetts, with all the industrial giants in the slave cloth and the Industrial Revolution was happening in the North, but it couldn't happen without the cotton that was being generated in the South. So their fortunes here in the North were very deeply rooted in the South and slavery. And so it was a financial motivation to create this false propaganda and to circulate it at a time when the country is divided, poisoning the way people saw black people and the way they thought about black people. And so, like I said, you kind of see the same thing happening again in the dangers of misinformation, but it had a purpose, and it was usually financially motivated. The other thing that this case talks about is not only cultural appropriation, but who has a right to the violence of the past. This is what my battle, my struggle with Harvard has always been. Harvard has said, and I'll talk a little more about the legal part of the case in a moment, but their argument is that a picture, irregardless of the violence, irregardless of how you acquire it, always belongs to the photographer. And it's settled law, and there's no debate about that. And that didn't make sense to me. And it was Stephanie, when she introduced me as a probation officer. I worked for many years establishing restitution accounts, working with victims of child pornography. And even now there's this concept called where people are sharing photos, nude photos of each other, what is it called?
Revenge porn.
There you go. Okay, so there's laws that says that the person who is the victim of that has a right, not only to those images, but how they're disposed of or what happens to them. So I knew that that didn't make sense to me, and I just like, that just can't fly. But beyond that, Renty and Delia were crime victims because when Harvard commissioned these photographs, it was illegal to do. This is the fruit of the poisonous tree, it's plunder, it's a violation of the 13th and 14th Amendment. This is the badges of slavery. And so when you do something, when you break the law, when you commit a crime, and there's something tangible that you acquire out of that criminality, you don't get to keep it. You don't get to then go on and make millions from it. And to be unjustly enriched from it. It just doesn't happen. So our argument was very simple, though Harvard tried to create, all of these distractions about photography. And mind you, one of the arguments is, Harvard was saying, the photographer always owns the photo. They were not the photographer. J.T. Zealy, a photographer in South Carolina, was the photographer. So that argument should have fell on its face. And beyond that, they also argued that they ignored the fact that there was a crime that was committed. And when in 1778, the state abolished slavery when they enacted their new constitution with the Mambet case. And they said, slavery was an aberration and inconsistent with our constitution. And then when Harvard commissioned the daguerreotypes, long after that, what they did was illegal, so it was a crime. And in civil language, it's called a tort. And the courts acknowledged that Harvard was the tortfeasor. They had done something wrong. So I'm thinking, this really is a no-brainer, right? Even though one of the challenges we had was surviving this statutory limitation about how long should you wait before bringing a case. And what's interesting, like I talk about how things are happening currently, recently, the state Supreme Court recently ruled that the Tulsa families their case could not move forward. They dismissed it. One of the historic things about this case, there have been many reparations cases that have been presented in court, and each and every one of them has been dismissed for lack of standing. In my case, as it stands now, I know at the end of this clip it said I had appealed to the Supreme Court, and we had a very victorious ruling from that court. And if you haven't seen it, some of the links are online. It's amazing what the types of questioning and what happened. And their ruling, 91-page ruling, was a stinging indictment of Harvard. But I stand here today as the only person in the history of this country who has ever brought a reparations case, and it has survived the motion to dismiss and can proceed. Yes, can proceed to a judgment. And the other thing that I wanted to mention was I have talked to many people who are photographers who say, this is not how we do business, about the judgment where the court is saying, you can take a photo and it doesn't matter how you acquire it, it's yours. Photographers say, that's not true. That's not true, and if we were to take someone, kidnap someone, force them to take their clothes off and take pictures of them and market them, we'd be in jail. These are things that don't, and we would not have a controlling interest in the photographers. There's also the archivists and the people who are working with museums on curation who talk about ethical stewardship and the fact that if you have cultural property of either an individual or a group, you have a duty, and it's not only just a moral, ethical duty, but now there is policy in place that you have to, if you have cultural property that belongs to someone, and you don't have it lawfully, as Harvard didn't, you have an obligation to give it back. And so we had a group of people who were archivists who wrote a brief for our case. I had a German attorney who talked about the history of the Holocaust and how the world responded to it, and that, she builds the case that nothing was ever done similarly for slavery, and there were no tribunals or any accountability for slavery, and how it creates an atmosphere where people think it's okay to appropriate other people's story, particularly when it comes to slavery. And, I've heard from people in Europe, particularly another one who wrote a brief from us. He is a professor at Oxford University, where we talk about repatriation and what, the Benin's bronze and other artifacts that have been wrongfully appropriated in the act of giving things back. And that's what they're promoting in Europe, and how this is very similar here in the United States. And so, like I said, there's so much that I can talk about. For this moment, I just want to kind of focus on my mom and the oral history. I would not be standing here today were it not for the generational love in my family. My mother, you saw a picture of her. She was the light of my life. I love my mother probably more than a daughter should. We were very, very, very close. My mom was born in a small rural community of Mount Meigs, Montgomery, Alabama. And she grew up in an extended family where everybody lived together, cousins, aunts, uncles, they were all like in earshot, they all lived together. And my mom grew up in a household with her grandfather, who was born a slave, who had lived many years as a slave, who told her the stories about Papa Renty and the stories of her enslaved ancestors. And one of the things my mom would share with me is she would often talk about the reverence that they had for their enslaved ancestors, that they were this community of people who were revered and respected, survivors. That's one thing we don't do. We often hear about survivors of other epics, of other Holocausts, of other tragedies, but we were never taught to think about slavery and those who survived it as survivors. And so my mom talked about that special reverence, and my mom would tell me these stories. Like when I say as far back as I can remember, as far back as I can remember, when I remember remembering, I can associate these stories of Papa Renty. And my mom had never seen the images. She only had met, my mom's grandfather, who she was raised with, he was also named Renty. There are 5 generations of men named after that man in my direct line. And so, when I share with the attorneys, I share that's how much this man meant to his family, and that's how much he was loved. And so that generational love was passed down from my mom's ancestors to my mom, to me, to my children. When my children were old enough to understand, my mom told them these stories. I talk about my children when they were small. I called them lap babies because I was blessed with an opportunity. My mother loved her grandchildren, and I didn't have to worry about anyone with daycare or anything. I just went to my mom's house, plopped them in her lap, and I was good. And they were good. And so my mom would sit in her chair and tell these kids the stories just as she did to us. And so when Harvard attacks my legacy, I feel like it's a slap in my mom's face, which makes me fight even more harder. It makes me dig even more deeper because it's an insult to my family, but most importantly, it's an insult to her and the love and the respect that she had for this man. So that is my motivation. It's an honor to my mother. And when she became ill, towards the latter stage of her life, she told these stories often, but she just was so determined in the last stages of her life. She had diabetes and then complications related to that, and dialysis and all of these things that kind of, while her body was under attack spiritually, she was grounded. And the one thing that she would say is, I want you to always remember these things. I want you to write them down. And so one afternoon I went in and, she's giving me the names of Renty's children and all of these things. And I started recording her. And thank God I did that. I don't know why I had the presence of mind to do that, because, even some of my cousins, well, I don't remember it this way. And I said, well, that's okay, because I have her recorded talking about it. So I'm not trying to create a narrative. And this is, when I talk later about how God has put people in my path and information at my fingertips that otherwise is not explainable. And like my daughter, my oldest daughter, when she was in 5th grade, her and my mom wrote a book, because my mom said, I always want you to write it down. And so my daughter did a 5th grade book project. And she entitled it From These Roots, and it's dedicated to her little sister, so she'll always know where she's from. I am kind of this crazy person. I keep all my kids' things. I have their first coloring books. I have their kindergarten papers and everything. I go up in my attic. When Harvard is telling the press she can never prove that her Renty is our Renty, I go up in my attic and I'm pulling out all these things. We were talking about Papa Renty before the daguerreotypes were discovered. So it wasn't like I just learned about these pictures and now I'm trying to fit it to a narrative. I have my receipts, and that's something I said all along, is I can prove everything that I'm saying. And so we were just blessed to go forward in court. We presented, and the court really just spanked Harvard and said, you go back and not only sue them, but they enlarged our complaint to give me an opportunity to sue for the emotional distress inflicted on me and my enslaved ancestors. So, yes. So.
Juneteenth, a holiday that we commemorate. When I got asked to do this project, I was thinking about it. Like a holiday. What do we do during the holidays? Tamara mentioned how her mother, grandmother, they transfer history. We share our histories. We talk about our families. And what is Juneteenth? Juneteenth is one of those days. I'm gonna go over the history. Juneteenth, also known as Freedom Day or Emancipation Day, commemorates the emancipation of enslaved African Americans in the United States. On June 19, 1865, Union Army General Gordon Granger and 2,000 Union troops rode into Galveston, Texas. Reading General Order Number 3, announcing the end of slavery to 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation issued by President Abraham Lincoln. That was on January 1st, 1863, declaring all enslaved people in Confederate-controlled territories to be free. General Order Number 3 read, as it stated, the people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality, right? Equality. This is 1865. And what are we still talking about and fighting for today? Equality. Equality of personal rights, rights of property between farmer, masters, and slaves. The connection hereto existing between them becomes that employer and hired labor. Freedmen are advised to remain at their present homes and work for wages. Said work for wages. However, this order was ignored until after the harvest was completed, and then they were freed. that will not be allowed, they will not be allowed to collect at military posts, and they will not be supported in the idleness either there or elsewhere. And it goes on to say, after the slaves heard this of their freedom, they rejoiced. But like Tamara, a lot of those slaves left the plantation in search of their families, in search of their heritage, in search of their culture, in search of their rights. You know, a lot of them was saving money to buy family out of slavery. We don't talk about that much in history. How slaves worked in the middle of the night sewing, collecting money so they can buy freedom for other family members. And how that money sometimes was confiscated as property of their slave owners. We don't talk about it. Juneteenth has since become an important day of reflection, celebration, and education about American history. You know, when I read that, I was doing the research and I read that over and over and over, and I like, celebration of American history. Celebration of American history, and in 2024, they're telling us we can't even teach it. Yeah, I will. In 2024, they're telling us we can't teach American history. And in some states, if you teach it, you can get sued. But a celebration of American history. Juneteenth has since become an important day of reflection and celebration of American history. It marks the various events as parades, concerts, and community gatherings across the country. Now, when they first freed the slaves in Galveston, they celebrated. They had parades. Galveston kept this going. And eventually caught on across the country. I'm going to be honest, my first encounter with Juneteenth, I was in Italy when I heard a Juneteenth celebration. Then I went to Japan and I heard it again, right? And I actually went to a little festival for Juneteenth when I was in Japan. But they were celebrating it there. I didn't hear celebrations here until I was over there. I was in the Navy at that time. In 2021, the Juneteenth celebration gained increased recognition when President Joe Biden signed the bill into law, making Juneteenth a federal holiday, known as June National Independence Day. Here we are in 2021, and we finally get what was given to us, supposed to be given to us in 1865. A holiday. President Biden, in one of his speeches, said, "Great nations don't ignore their most powerful moments." Yeah, we've been doing it for years. They don't ignore the moments of the past. They embrace them. Great nations don't walk away. We come to terms with the mistakes we made. Notice he said we come to terms with the mistakes we made. He didn't say the rights. He said the mistakes we made. And in remembering those moments, we begin to heal and grow stronger. Juneteenth has grown into significance over the years, evolving into a day of remembrance, celebration, reflection, struggle, achievement of African Americans. It serves as a reminder of the ongoing fight for civil rights and equality. This celebration inspires future, shouldn't, I hope, that this happens because Tamara spoke of her grandson, right? It should inspire hope in the younger generation to fight for their rights, to continue to fight, continue to move forward, right? Especially with a day that they can stop and think about it. You know, we look at holidays, Veterans Day, Memorial Day. We look at all these holidays, Christmas. When I first started writing this, I don't know why, but the song Chestnuts Roasting on the Open Fire crossed my mind. And I was sitting there, why is this song so strong in my mind? But I thought about it. When we look at celebrating and reflecting on our history, how many people can sit down and say they couldn't wait for Thanksgiving and Christmas because somebody was going to come up with a family member's secret recipe? Whether it's a cake, a pie, or some dish, we sat down and we talk about, like Tamara's grandmother, talk about how this thing was made and who started it. Grandma from great-great-grandma started it. You know, I look at my family. My grandmother make this great potato salad. And I used to eat that potato salad like it was no tomorrow. There's only one person in our family that knows that recipe. Well, two. My aunt and her daughter. They even come close. But I look at when you reflect on that, and you go back, and you say, how far can I go back? We talk about family being enslaved, but how far beyond that? We can't talk that language because a large portion of our families was sold, separated. It wasn't sold to the neighbor, you know. They were sold and transported elsewhere. And when this celebration happened, people went looking for their families. And I was stunned when the research said a lot of them, most of them, spent their lifetime looking and never found. Never found. Imagine that. You enslaved, you get out, and you go in search of your family. And you spend a lifetime dedicated and never find them. Remembering the important challenges of this Juneteenth and the narratives that are associated with our communities, our culture, our people. I look at this Juneteenth holiday as a time to reflect and a holiday that helps us to begin to correct the wrongs of the past. And I hope that someday future generations could stand up and say, we're equal. We finally have won our independence.
Well, first of all, a disclaimer, I am not a historian. I am simply a resident of Waterford who was curious about the people who lived in this area before we moved in here. And I was particularly interested in those people whose names have been forgotten, whose names are not on street signs, they're not on the parks or the public buildings, people whose stories have not been told. And specifically, I wanted to learn more about those who lived here in Waterford, but did so as enslaved persons. So I'm going to introduce you to some of those individuals. As Tamara indicated, I was under the impression that slavery was only something that happened in the South. It never occurred to me that it would be happening right here in Waterford, in places where we now live. So I'd like to begin with this quote from a book entitled Tapestry, A Living History of the Black Family in Southeastern Connecticut, which indicated that the voyage from the Indies usually took from 18 to 25 days. Because of piracy, disease, and frequency of great storms, it was a perilous one. Upon their arrival in New London, slaves found even greater hazards: the necessity of adapting themselves to the strict ways of their masters, the constant struggle against disease, the inhumanity of their owners, and above all, the never-ending battle to maintain their dignity and their identity. And I really appreciate how Tamara has led right into that idea. Nevertheless, many did survive both the voyage and the hostile environment to plant, figuratively, the seeds of numerous black families along the shores of the Thames. One such seed was planted in that part of New London now called Upper Mammacoke. And as a matter of fact, that's the part of Waterford where I now live. So we have here an old map of the area with the Thames River to the right. This entire area was referred to as Upper Mammacoke, or in some cases, Mammacock. To help to locate for us today, these double line, solid line is Old Norwich Road, and the double dotted line, what is now Route 32. So currently we would see Lyman Allen Museum here, the Coast Guard Academy nearer the river, the Conn College campus here, and athletic area here. I discovered from a book entitled The Rogerines that John Rogers' home farm extended on both sides of the Norwich Road 2 miles from New London, and was called Mammacock Farm from the small rocky peninsula of that name, which was one of its eastern boundaries. It was bordered for some distance by the Thames River. The original portion, Mammacock proper, was originally a grant to the Reverend Mr. Blindman. It was but a part of his landed estate, much of which he disposed of in his lifetime by gift. He was buried upon the bank of the Thames within the bounds of the Mammacock Farm, and that cemetery still exists today. It is right next to the Connecticut College athletic field. In that cemetery is a large boulder with a plaque on it that reads, "Rogers Family Burying Ground." In 1751, John Rogers deeded to his sons, their children, and, quote, their children after them from generation to generation forever, a burying place where several of my family are already buried on Mammacock Farm, near the riverside. Among them was his father, John, 1648 to 1721. And this plaque was installed on that boulder by the Waterford Historic Properties Commission. Today, that cemetery looks like this, with the boulder and the plaque on it and a few scattered headstones there, and that's all that remains. Now, the focus is not on the Rogers or on the people whose names may be familiar to you who are familiar with Waterford history, but on those individuals who were enslaved in this area. So I'd first like to introduce you to Hagar Wright. in this excerpt from Tapestry, A Living History of the Black Family in Southeastern Connecticut, we find that John Rogers had acquired extensive land holdings and a number of black and Indian servants. Now, servants and slaves can be used interchangeably. But what's interesting to me about that statement is that coupled in the same phrase are extensive land holdings and a number of black and Indian servants. All of it property, of course, and that's because those individuals were seen as property. Among them were William Wright, an Indian, and Hagar, his black wife, a deaf-mute Negro woman named Maria, and her daughter Joan, and a mulatto indentured servant named Adam Rogers. John Rogers was inspired to begin his own religious group, and by 1680 he had established what became known as the Rogerine movement. William lived on the Mammacoke plantation with his wife Hagar. In 1685, William had signed an agreement with James Rogers Sr. to the effect that he and his bride would serve him for a term of 6 years, after which time they were to receive their freedom. Now, this was a very unusual kind of arrangement that was made. Interesting also in the fact that that agreement was signed on the same day that William and Hagar were married. Now, it also emphasizes the fact that they would remain enslaved persons for a period of time, and that is further borne out by this inventory of the property of James Rogers, which identifies common household items, kettles, platters, beds, house and barn. And then we come to an Indian servant, not mentioned here, but we know his name. This was William Wright. William Wright. And his wife, a Negro woman who, of course, is Hagar Wright. About 3 years, they had 3 years left to serve at this time. And their worth, how can any person put a monetary value on another human being? But here we have 8 pounds is what their value was considered to be. And Adam, the mulatto servant, had 3 years to serve, and a Negro woman, deaf and dumb, which would be Maria, worth 2 pounds. No more than a copper kettle and a brass kettle. 2 pounds. There is, unlike many of the people that I learned about, there is quite a bit of information about Hagar. But so that we have time for the other ones, I'm going to skip ahead. We'll maybe save that for another time, to a later period of Hagar's life, the 1700s, when Hagar's family was somewhat scattered, but it seems to have been understood that each would have his freedom when he came of age. In fact, John Rogers Jr. and his aunt Bathsheba continued to assist Hagar and her children when, in 1709, their right to freedom was brought into question by John's brother James. John and Bathsheba appeared before the governor's council and certified that Hagar and her children had indeed been released from certitude by John Rogers Sr. Thus, Hagar Wright weathered the storms of racism and religious bigotry. So, although Hagar was one of the few enslaved people to gain her freedom, she was never free from the fear that she could be re-enslaved. That's a reality that she had to live with. And before we leave that Quaker Hill part of Connecticut, I would also like to show you another inventory of the property of John Rogers. Now, this is a later John Rogers. We're now up to 1753, with the kinds of things that you would expect in the inventory of a person's property. Their clothes, a Bible, silver spoons, chairs, and so forth. Until we come to the next page where we have geese, a woolen wheel, linen, a Negro man named James, 500 pounds, one named Abner, 500 pounds, a Negro woman named Dinah, full of infirmities, worth nothing, as estimated by those. This is the most gut-wrenching discovery that I came across in my research. How can any individual say that another human being has no value, no worth? It's incomprehensible. But let's move on. I'd like to introduce you next to Nero Allen. Now, I have a copy, as a matter of fact, of a document that provided Nero Allen with his freedom. It's a document which, oh, sure, which looks like this, but I'm guessing that you might have a little difficulty reading that from where you're sitting. I have difficulty reading it when I have the paper in front of me. So a transcribed version would look something like this. Whereas William Eldridge of Waterford has this day made application to us as selectmen of the town for liberty to emancipate or make free his black man by the name of Nero Allen, and we, having thoroughly inquired with respect to the age and circumstances of said servant, do certify that Mr. Eldridge hath liberty to emancipate and set at liberty his servant or slave. This document and Nero's freedom took place then in 1813. Now, I know very little more about Nero, but I was curious as to where in Waterford this took place, where he lived, where he worked. And I was able to find another virtually illegible document. This one is a deed that, well, let me show you the transcribed version of it. Know you that we, William and Eliza Eldridge of New London, in the county of New London and the state of Connecticut, for the consideration of $1,119.44, received to our full satisfaction of Latham Avery of Demerara, do give, grant, bargain, sell, and confirm unto the said Latham Avery a certain farm lying in the town of Waterford in said county of New London, 5 miles from New London, on the Hartford Turnpike Road, being the Way Farm, so called, containing 130 acres more or less. Well, when I read this, I assumed that the Hartford Turnpike Road is what we would now call Route 85. Apparently not so, because in this quote from an illustrated history of Waterford, Connecticut, we find that the Hartford and New London Turnpike Company constructed a new road west of the 1704 country road to Colchester, and this new road was first called the New London Turnpike, then Cohansey Road, and now Vauxhall Street Extension. So I got in my car and I drove to the intersection of William Street and Vauxhall Street in New London and headed 5 miles out of town and found that I ended up very close to the Montville town line. And so the indication is that that is the area where Nero Allen lived until he gained his freedom. I came across another deed. This one, the first one was dated 1808 of the sale of the land. This one dated 1813, the same year that Nero Allen was emancipated. So it raised in my mind what might have been behind the motivation for the Eldridges to emancipate Nero. And obviously by this point they had sold a total of 260 acres of land. I don't know if, and William Eldridge was closing in on 45 years of age, and I don't know if he was just done with farming, whether his wife Elizabeth was looking for a more genteel lifestyle in the big city of New London maybe, and there could be a lot of other reasons that would explain the reasons for that, but any of those would be speculation. So let's move from the Cohansey area to the Great Neck area to introduce you to Pluto. Now, Pluto's story is set in the early 1700s. As a matter of fact, he was very well known throughout the area for his skill in mowing. And unfortunately, this talent would cost him his life because his notoriety encouraged or motivated his enslaver to arrange for a challenge, a contest between Pluto and another skilled mower who was a white man. And this story is recounted in an article that was in the New London Day back in 1923, and it's a lengthy article. So I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm going to read you a condensed version of that article. The contest took place on a farm owned at the time by Ebenezer Darrow on the west side of Jordan Cove. The owner of Pluto lived on a big farm known by the name of Whitehall, which was in the southern part of Great Neck, and which at the time of the famous contest was owned by the Tabors, a very wealthy family. This family always had 4 to 6 slaves, male and female, and of course Pluto was the most renowned, not only of the bondsmen of his master, but of all the slaves that were owned on adjoining farms. The contest between the slave and white man took place in a square lot of 8 acres, the western portion of which was more elevated than any other section of what, in reality, was a rather level field. The lot was surrounded by a single wall about 4 feet in height on which scores of men, women, and children sat or leaned. The master of ceremonies ordered the combatants to open a double swath over the width of the field from east to west. It was to be a battle of endurance coupled with clean mowing. At the word go, the black took the lead and the white man followed one clip behind. The scorching rays of the July sun were slightly tempered by a southwest breeze that came off the waters of Long Island Sound. Still, the heat was very great, and the mowers soon showed the effects of its intensity by the large beads of perspiration that stood out on their temples and foreheads. The pace so far maintained by the mowers could not hold much longer as the heat increased and the breeze died out. The black was several times requested to call himself beaten, but he only shook his head. Like a man driven to desperation, the Negro once more struck up a rapid pace, only to find his strength fast failing and obtaining no advantage. At the hottest hour of the day, when the mowers were once more nearing the side hill, the Negro again mustered up his waning strength and started to mow up the incline. But he was seen to stop short, and dropping his sigh, he reeled backward with his hands pressed over his heart. Gasping inaudibly, he fell to the earth a corpse. It's important to understand that Pluto did not choose to participate in this spectacle, no more than Renty chose to participate in that photograph session. And I call it a spectacle because in the article it indicates that, quote, the cultured Tabor women were there with other rich matrons and their daughters, and there was a good sprinkling of slaves of both sexes, all keyed up with the excitement occasioned by the contest. So whether it was spoken or unspoken, it's reasonable to assume that the question of racial superiority was at work in this competition. And I'll leave it to each of you to decide what the significance of the outcome of that event might have meant to each of the racial groups represented there that day. And lastly, I'd like to move a little further west to Durfee Hill. How many of you know where Durfee Hill is? I didn't know where Durfee Hill was when I began this project, but if you are driving on Rope Ferry Road toward Niantic, past the ball fields there, and then you start up a hill to the entrance of Millstone, that's Durfee Hill. And you may not have noticed, but no, let's go back. Set back a little ways from the road on the left is the Durfee Hill Cemetery, where there are several large monuments to the Durfee and Champion families who owned property in that area. There are a few headstones scattered in there. However, a ground penetrating scan has shown that in another part of that cemetery there are some unmarked graves, possibly the graves of some of the Durfees were one of the largest slave-holding families in the area. And so it may or may not be the bodies of those individuals. Come on. There we go. So to indicate in this old map the locality of that, here's the Rope Ferry Road coming over to where there's a bridge there now between Waterford and Niantic. At the time, there was, believe it or not, a rope ferry there. But here we have land belonging to Richard Durfee, to Sarah Durfee, Thomas Durfee. So basically the whole area that is now Millstone, that complex, was owned by the Durfees. Now again, this is not about the white enslavers. The only thing that I was able to find about the people enslaved on that property was this list of the names of 17 enslaved people who were enslaved by Richard Durfee. What stood out to me is that although we only have their names, they were real people who lived here in this town long before us. They had hopes and dreams, they had needs, they loved, they had families, they lived, they died just like any of us. And we may not know anything more about them. I did not find anything more. But at least we have their names. And the least I think we can do to honor them and their presence here in our town is to let their names be spoken aloud once again. And so I'm going to ask that you join me in reading the names of these individuals to honor them. They are Lambo, Sawney, Elsa, Tony, Prince, Phyllis, Jenny, Katip, Cuff, David, Dinah, Hercules, Jack, Jen, Nan, Primus, and Robin. Thank you for recalling with me the names of all of these individuals that have been largely forgotten, but whom today we have remembered. In what was described earlier in that quote as a never-ending battle to maintain their dignity and identity. Thank you.